Since I was a child, I never had much interest in circuses. To me, they were just ordinary places, full of noise, forced laughter, and flashing lights. But that particular circus had something different. It seemed to have appeared out of nowhere, without any prior notice or publicity. There were no flyers scattered around the city, no TV commercials or radio ads, just an old hand-painted poster hanging on a rusty pole in the center of the square. The letters, in a faded red hue, formed the phrase, "The Great Show of Dreams." Something in that writing made me hesitate. Maybe it was the irregular lines or the paint that seemed to have dripped, forming stains like drops of blood. A shiver ran down my spine, but I decided to ignore it. My friends were excited, and the last thing I wanted was to seem like a coward. When we arrived, the setting seemed like any other circus. Colorful lights blinked on decorated wires, lively music played in the background, and the sweet scent of popcorn mixed with the earthy smell of sawdust spread across the floor. Children laughed while holding balloons, and cotton candy vendors shouted to attract customers. But as I looked closer, I realized something was wrong. It was as if the performers were different. The clowns, for example, had dark, deep eyes, as if they were portals to something far beyond human understanding. They smiled exaggeratedly, but their lips seemed cut up to their ears, exposing teeth that glistened strangely. The trapeze artists, with their fluid and graceful movements, wore sharp, almost predatory smiles, as if they were expecting something more from the audience than just applause. My mind struggled to rationalize everything. Maybe it was just part of a macabre aesthetic, something intentional to create a dark charm. After all, many shows seek that atmosphere to attract the curious. Even so, with every moment spent in that place, my unease grew. The performers' eyes seemed to follow me, as if they could see something within me that even I didn't know. While my friends laughed and had fun, I felt a weight in the air, something invisible but overwhelming. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had made a mistake by entering that circus. When the show began, the initial discomfort turned into sheer terror. The performances had something wrong with them, something that couldn't be explained. The juggler was the first to perform, throwing knives into the air with impressive precision, but soon I realized he wasn't really holding them. The blades floated around him, spinning as if they had a life of their own, while he merely gestured in the air. Then a woman emerged in a glass tank full of water, moving as if she had no bones. Her body bent at impossible angles, each movement accompanied by sounds that seemed like bones breaking. The audience applauded, but my stomach churned with each passing moment. Then came the magician's turn, and everything became even more disturbing. He called a person from the audience to participate in a disappearing trick. The person entered the box, the magician uttered some strange words, and when he opened the lid again, it was empty. The audience erupted in applause, but no one seemed to care that the person never reappeared. Confused and scared, I tried to find answers. I approached one of the circus workers, a tall, thin man with a faded uniform and a smile that seemed glued to his face. When I asked what was going on, he tilted his head slightly and replied in a low but clear voice, "No one leaves the great show without becoming part of it." What did he mean by that? Before I could press for more questions, he turned and vanished between the tents as if swallowed by the air. His words echoed in my mind, causing panic to take hold. It was at that moment that I decided I needed to leave, but I realized things wouldn't be that simple. The exits were locked, and the path through which we had entered no longer existed. As I searched for an exit, the environment around me seemed to change. The tents stretched, corridors appeared and closed, as if the circus itself were alive, trying to keep me inside. The laughter, which had once come from the spectators, now echoed through the corners, distorted and ghostly, as if something invisible were following me. Every time I turned a corner, I saw shadowy figures moving at the edge of my vision, but when I got closer, There was no one there. It was like an endless maze where time seemed to not exist, and the air grew heavier with each passing moment. My legs trembled, my heart raced, and one certainty took hold of me. This place was no ordinary circus, and if I didn't leave soon, I might never leave at all. After desperately running through tents that seemed to stretch endlessly, I found an opening. It was small, hidden among the torn fabrics, as if it wasn't meant to be seen. Without thinking twice, I squeezed through it and finally got out. But what I saw outside terrified me even more. The circus was no longer in the city. Instead, it was in the middle of a vast, desolate field, surrounded by a thick mist that seemed alive, serpentine, twisting around me. The silence was absolute, broken only by the muffled sound of my own heartbeat. When I looked back, I realized I wasn't alone. All the performers were there, lined up at the entrance of the tent, their eyes fixed on me. The magician, with a cruel smile, took a step forward and said in a cold voice, "You shouldn't have tried to escape." Before I could react or run, I felt something grab me. They weren't visible hands, but an irresistible force pulling me back inside. I fought with all my might, kicking and trying to hold onto the ground, but it was useless. I was dragged into the darkness of the tent, while distorted, echoing laughter filled the air. The clearest sound was that of a clown, whose laughter seemed to pierce my mind, repeating itself like an infernal melody. My vision began to fade, swallowed by shadows, until everything turned dark. The last thing I felt was the cold touch of those invisible forces gripping me, and then everything vanished. Today I'm here, telling this story, but not because I managed to escape. If you're listening, it's because somehow your attention was drawn to me, or to them. I'm still trapped in the great show of dreams, doomed to repeat this story to anyone willing to listen. Every time I finish, they force me to start again. It's as if my voice is both a warning and a trap at the same time. So please, listen carefully. If you ever come across this circus, don't enter, don't get close, don't look at the posters, and most of all, don't try to find out more about it. Because now that you've heard my voice, you're already in their sights. Don't look back. They are watching you. I have always had a fascination with the circus. Since I was a child, it was impossible not to be enchanted by the vibrant lights, the contagious laughter of the clowns, and the impressive skill of the jugglers. To me, the circus has always been a world of magic, where everything seemed possible. But all of that changed 3 months ago. An unexpected experience completely transformed the way I view these places. It all started when a small circus arrived in town. It appeared quietly, almost as if it had appeared out of nowhere. The promotion was minimal, but a friend mentioned how cheap the tickets were and that the show promised to be memorable. Driven by curiosity, I decided to buy a ticket, not realizing that I was about to dive into something far beyond entertainment. That night, I decided to go alone to the circus. My friends, who initially planned to go with me, backed out at the last minute. When I arrived, I noticed that the place exuded something strange, almost oppressive. It wasn't just the unusual silence that hung in the air. It was as if the very air itself was heavier. The circus seemed different from anything I had ever seen before, and that feeling left me uneasy. Even so, I entered the main tent, believing that everything would dissipate once the show began. However, what I found inside was even more disturbing. The lights were dim, almost suffocating, and most of the seats were empty, occupied only by a handful of people. But there was something about them that didn't seem right. They were motionless, not talking to each other, and staring at the stage with a vacant, almost unsettling gaze. As I settled in, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't just the abandoned look of the place or the behavior of the people around me. It was as if a dark energy enveloped everything. Small details began to catch my attention. The frayed curtains, the smell of burnt wood, and the faint, almost inaudible sound of some old music playing in the background. Every second there felt like an eternity, and my initial curiosity gave way to an increasing unease. Little did I know that this mysterious show was about to become the worst nightmare of my life, something I would never forget. The show began with the entrance of a thin man, dressed as a presenter, whose presence was as unsettling as the environment itself. His voice, hoarse and almost whispered, seemed not only to fill the tent, but to resonate directly in my mind. He didn't shout or try to command attention, but each word he spoke carried a strange weight. With a theatrical gesture, he announced the first act, a clown. However, this was not the kind of clown who made jokes or pulled off childish tricks. He stood still at the center of the stage, staring at the audience with a fixed, disconcerting smile. What was most disturbing, however, were his eyes. Unlike his face, frozen in a joyful expression, his eyes were full of life, as if they were meticulously analyzing each person present. It was a gaze that seemed to pierce through my soul. When the clown finally began to move, the sound of his shoes echoed throughout the tent, each step amplified in a way that seemed impossible. He walked slowly, but his presence was overwhelming. Then, he pointed directly at me. At first, I thought it was part of the show, a comedic interaction to entertain the audience. But time seemed to slow down as he advanced toward me, with steps that grew louder and more disturbing. I looked around, expecting reactions, but the audience remained motionless, as if frozen in time. When he stopped right in front of me, the smell that emanated was unbearable, a mix of rotten meat and something even more unpleasant like rust and blood. He slowly bent down until he was at eye level with me and whispered something. His voice was low and incomprehensible, but the feeling it left was pure terror. Before I could react or understand what was happening, the lights suddenly went out. An absolute darkness engulfed the tent, and for a few seconds, there was no sound, no movement, or any sign of life. My heart raced so fast it seemed to echo inside my chest. The silence was terrifying, as if the world had stopped at that moment. When the lights finally came back on, I felt a shiver run down my spine. The clown had disappeared. Half of the audience, including the strange figures that had been motionless before, had also vanished without a trace. I was left there, alone, paralyzed by fear, trying to process what had just happened. While the air around me seemed heavier and more suffocating, when I tried to escape, something felt wrong. I ran toward the exit, but it was as if the circus tent had grown monstrously large. The paths that had once been clear disappeared, replaced by endless hallways that twisted and turned. Desperation grew inside me with every step. No matter where I ran, there was no escape. When I finally stopped, breathless, I heard a low laugh that seemed to come from all directions. I looked at the stage, and there was the presenter, with that crooked smile that didn't seem human. He pointed at me, and with his hoarse, hypnotic voice, he enthusiastically announced, "And now, ladies and gentlemen, the next act, our special guest." My blood ran cold. The lights went out again, and the sound of distorted laughter and drums began to fill the air. I screamed, but no sound came out. In the midst of the darkness, I felt something grab my arms tightly. They weren't human hands. They were cold, rough, like wood or metal. I struggled, but my strength seemed to fade with each second. The laughter grew louder, mixed with the increasing beat of a drum. It felt maddening, as if my own heart were beating to the rhythm of that eerie music. My vision started to fade, and just before I completely passed out, I felt the ground tremble beneath me. It was as if something was dragging me to a place that didn't belong to this world. The drum, now deafening, was the last thing I heard before losing consciousness. When I woke up, I was in the open air, lying on the cold, damp ground of a place that seemed completely empty. I looked around, and the circus had vanished. There was no sign of the tent, the chairs, or anything that indicated that place ever existed. My friends, worried, said I had been missing for 3 days. I can't remember anything except that terrible moment. But since then, I feel a constant presence, as if someone or something was always watching me. Sometimes when passing by abandoned lots or deserted parks, I hear that distant sound of the drum beating. And the worst part is what I see in the mirror. Whenever I stare for too long, I get the impression that there's a clown standing behind me, watching, with that horrible smile.